Hey there, friends, and welcome to this episode of Self Kind, a podcast for highly sensitive people. If you're a highly sensitive person, you are absolutely in the right place. I am your host, Erica Webb. I am also a highly sensitive person, diagnosed autistic ADHD, and a registered counsellor working with other highly sensitive and neurodivergent people to navigate all the really tricky parts of being sensitive in a world that often feels very at odds with our needs. So, today I wanted to talk about a question that came through from a listener. I love it when you send me questions. So, let that be an invitation to send me in yours if you've got one. But the question was around work as a highly sensitive person. And I'm going to speak kind of broadly about this topic. And if you've got questions about, sort of more of the nuance and more of the specifics, please do let me know. But I thought it would be really useful to talk about work as a highly sensitive person because we spend a lot of hours doing work as adults, which is, you know, the reality that we find ourselves in. And so what we do matters. And as highly sensitive folk, work can be a place of great stress. And that's certainly been my experience. So I've worked as a yoga teacher for 15 years, and that work has suited me very, very well. My work as a counselor also suits me very well. But in a lifetime before that, I worked in the corporate environment, and that environment did not suit me at all. In fact, I would say with hindsight that I absolutely burnt out in that environment, probably not just once, but twice. And it was very, very hard to understand what was going on because when I looked around me, both at my colleagues and at my friends, nobody else was dealing with what I was dealing with. And so I very much internalized there's something wrong with me, right? Because I looked around and everybody else was able to hold down a 9 to 5. Everybody else seemed to be, content. And I was miserable. I was unhealthy. My mental health was suffering, and I just couldn't figure out how in the world I could possibly sustain that kind of life. And so when I talk about work, I just want to give that context, right? I have been out of the sort of traditional workforce for about 15 years, maybe even longer. And it came from burnout. However, I don't think that highly sensitive people are destined to have to exit the traditional workforce. I don't think that's true. I think that we can do anything we like. A highly sensitive person would make a brilliant doctor. A highly sensitive person would make a brilliant lawyer, potentially. But we have to be mindful of what we are being exposed to. We have to be mindful of how we look after ourselves. And we have to be willing, I think, to look outside the box if those traditional environments are harmful to us, which is how I ultimately ended up where I have ended up, because those environments, I just couldn't make them work. So I want to share with you, I guess, some of the reasons why workplaces can be difficult as highly sensitive people, and then talk through some hints and tips and ideas and strategies and just food for thought. If you're thinking about, like, what the heck do I do to suit my high sensitivity? I'm at work 8 hours a day. I'm burning out. Like, what are my options? So I guess one of the things to recognize is that, as a highly sensitive person in a work environment, you're in this sort of situation where, depending on whether you're working with colleagues or working with clients, or perhaps working with like quite a busy public situation, if you're working in retail or hospitality, for instance, you are exposed to the energy and the emotion and like just the presence of so many different people. And so if you are finding yourself to be a very empathetic type of highly sensitive person, then that's going to have a really big impact, right? So I think one of the things to consider is that part of the reason why work can feel challenging for highly sensitive people is partly because we're just exposed to so much input in the form of other people and their emotions, but also in terms of environmental input. So we can't usually control the lighting. We can't usually control the air conditioning and the heating. We can't usually control whether we're in an open plan situation or an office. We can't usually control how many customers walk through the door and how many times we, get interrupted in our work. So there are lots of reasons why, as people who process deeply and notice everything, there are certain environments where that is going to I guess, be more challenging than others. I also think that there is something that doesn't get talked about a lot for highly sensitive people, but it's around this idea of purpose and values. And in my experience, these are huge factors that we really need to take into account. When I think about why I burned out in those environments, a large part of it actually comes back to this because I couldn't kind of find myself in a position where I felt like what I was doing was meaningful. And the values that I had, which I hadn't articulated, but my values were very much at odds with not so much the workplace values as they were sort of claimed, but the way that they were demonstrated. And that is huge for a highly sensitive person. If our values are at odds with the spaces that we find ourselves in, it is really difficult. If we feel like we're showing up to work that doesn't have impact, that can be really difficult. Now, let me be clear when I say that we look for meaningful and impactful work, we don't have to be like, you know, solving the world peace problem. It doesn't have to be, by anybody else's standards. It just has to be meaningful to us. So that could be retail, that could be hospitality, that could be working with animals, that could be literally anything. But it has to have some meaning to us, right? We have to feel like we're making some kind of contribution or aligning with something that really matters to us. There are going to be exceptions to this rule, okay? So if you're listening and you're thinking, I don't need my work to be meaningful, trust that. You are your own best guide. But I want to raise that as a potential place to consider because it's easy to overlook. And I think, certainly in my experience, it has been a really big deal. So there's that. I also think that if we're exposed to unethical behavior, if we're exposed to unfair behavior or treatment, they can be huge triggers for sensitive people. And if we perceive rejection or if we perceive criticism, that can be really hard to process as well. And in work environments, that's often part of the deal, right? There's feedback and there's performance reviews and there's, conversations with bosses and colleagues and also often things like gossip amongst colleagues. And some of that stuff can be really difficult too. So if you are struggling at work and you're thinking, is it me? Am I the problem? Please hear that there are so many reasons why work can be challenging for a highly sensitive person. You are not broken. You are not wrong. It's just that you have this nervous system that is sensitive and picking up on so much stuff. And not everybody else is experiencing that the same way, right? That's important to recognize. Then, of course, there's also the environment. Like I said before, the bright lights, the inability to control the temperature, the inability to control how many people are coming into your space and how often you're being interrupted and how often the phone rings. And all of these things are things that can be tricky to navigate. Now, you can habituate and desensitize to some extent to some of these things if the work that you're doing is somewhere that you want to be, if you need to be, right? Sometimes some of us do not have the luxury of a million choices. And I understand that. Sometimes we just simply have to pay the bills. So, it's not like I am saying you just have to escape the whole thing and go and sit in a cave somewhere and opt out. But typically the capitalist culture that we live in is really kind of at odds with the natural way that we as sensitive folk kind of want to be in the world. So, it is inherently difficult. Um, I think it's worth thinking about what you can control. And if you're in a position to be thinking about a career change, or if you're entering the workforce, or having a bit of a midlife shift in what you do, it's worth considering all of these factors. If you are in a job and you're finding yourself feeling overwhelmed or overstimulated, it's worth thinking about what can I control. So that might be some of those environmental things. Perhaps you have more control than perhaps you can ask for accommodations. That is not always well received, and I've heard that from people that I've worked with, and so we have to be mindful of that as well. But also think about how you buffer what you're experiencing at work with how you look after yourself, right? So Oftentimes when I speak with clients who are struggling with work, we'll talk about how can we prepare for work, particularly if you're not in a position to just like leave, right? Which often people aren't. Um, how can we prepare and how can we sort of recuperate afterwards? So that might be um, not having a lot of input before you get to work. Now, hear me out on this one, because as a mum of school-aged children, I know that that can be very, very difficult. There's a lot of input into my system before, the workday starts, because you've got to make lunch boxes and breakfasts and get kids out the door and remind them, to get all their things and, you know, deal with fights and all the things. So, I'm a realist. However, there might be an opportunity to listen to something really calming and peaceful in the car on the drive into work or on your commute in the train or something. You might be able to put on something that feels regulating and supportive. It might be that you just have silence for your commute. It might be that you carve out a 5-minute period of time where you just drink your coffee and remove your phone, remove the things, and just allow yourself that time to be present with yourself. It might even be that you have a daily practice of movement or meditation or breathing that helps you to walk into work in a more regulated state. Because if we think about what's happening when we go through the workday, we're essentially maybe moving through the day kind of in a really regulated way and coping really well with everything that's going on. But it's also possible that as the day progresses, we are getting kind of closer to overstimulation, because it's like one more phone call, one more bright light, one more cold breeze, one more colleague interrupting you. And so we're kind of creeping up, edging towards overwhelm as the day progresses. So if we can do something to be more regulated before we enter that space, then that process might shift for us. Equally, if you can, there's also opportunities in the day to do some of that regulation work, right? Can you go outside on your lunch break and look at the sky? Can you sit and quietly consume your lunch, not eating at your desk? Can you, escape for a coffee with a colleague that you trust? We want to be thinking about, how do I support the reality of being a highly sensitive person in the workforce, rather than sitting with this idea that there's something wrong with me, I am broken, it's my fault. Um, all of that sort of stuff that we can get into in our head. I get it, but it doesn't help. Like it's not supportive. And so we want to be making that shift towards, okay, this is how I am, right? I am sensitive. I'm sensitive to my environment. I'm sensitive to criticism. I'm sensitive to these things. That's not so that we can use it as a crutch or an excuse or a whatever. It's everybody always kind of brings that up, and I get it. But it's actually just sitting with what is. Okay, this is how my brain processes the world. This is how my nervous system processes my environment. So if that's so, what can I do to support that? What can I do to support myself? What can I do to support my system? How can I be supported by others potentially and by my environment? That gives us more options. Whereas if we just think, oh, I'm a problem and I just have to kind of like get it together and do better and try harder, if that worked, we'd all be fine, right? Because we've tried harder. We've done that. So just something to consider. Um, One of the things that I didn't mention as well is, the nature of work that we do. Do you have a lot of deadlines? Is it really busy? Is the phone ringing off the hook all the time? Likewise, on the other end of the spectrum, is it kind of like not enough stimulation, not enough to do? Um, there are so many factors that go into work, and so perhaps this is something that might be useful and interesting. Um, it could be helpful, perhaps, to do a little inventory for yourself. Explore on paper, what are my particular sensitivities? How do they show up? And how are they influencing and impacting my work situation? And then where do I have control? Where might I be able to make some changes? Where might I be able to request some accommodations? Where might I be able to make some different choices? And if those things exist, great, we've got somewhere that we can start. But if not, then we might start asking some different questions. Um, I think that's kind of it. It's not it. I could talk for hours, as you can probably tell, but I think that's a good start. I would love to know what you would add. How do you, as a highly sensitive person, navigate work? What kind of work have you gone into as a highly sensitive person? Because I think that can be really helpful too. I think being a counsellor is an amazing job for a highly sensitive person. I think being a yoga teacher has been an incredible job as a highly sensitive person. I remember one of my favorite jobs was working at the bakery as a teenager. That was brilliant. There were times where I didn't love it and I was absolutely overstimulated. The corporate environment just didn't work as well for me. But had I really wanted to stay there, I know I could have. I know I could have found ways to support myself. The difference is, though, that back then I wasn't on my own side. I was so cruel to myself and so unfair, really. My expectations on myself were really quite unkind. And so I think if I was to re-enter the workforce in the traditional sense now as a 42-year-old, it would be very different. But I'm really grateful that I can actually control my environment the way that I do and do the kind of work that I do. So I would love to hear from you. What do you do as a highly sensitive person? What is the kind of work that you found that works for you? Or on the flip side, what are you finding really challenging? Share with us. I would love to hear. You can, if you're on YouTube, you can obviously comment under the video. If you're listening to this somewhere else outside of YouTube, you can send me a DM on Instagram. I'm at ericawebb_selfkind. You can also head to my website to find other contact details there, and that's ericawebb.com.au. And if you're looking for specific support, individual support for something that you're going through, I do also have a fairly limited number, but some availability for one-on-one counselling as well at the moment. So please feel free to reach out if you are in Australia and looking for a counsellor to support you with your specific needs. All right, until next time, friends, keep being kind to yourselves, and I will speak with you again really soon.